Hi everyone, my name is Lachlan and I'm a grade 12 student here at Uprising. I'm going to tell you a story about three brothers who were interning in Silicon Valley, United States in 1998. While interning there, they were intrigued by the concept of eBay and they got the idea that they should reproduce it in Germany. They discussed it and they went forward to implement it. It's important to note that these brothers reached out to eBay saying that eBay should set up an auction site in Germany and have them run it. But eBay did not respond, so in February 1999, they formed Alando, an online auction site just like eBay, and it went live March 1st, 1999. They hired three of their friends from college to help run and grow the company, which they successfully did. And on May 17th, the brothers received a call of interest from eBay in potentially acquiring their young startup company, Alando. And on May 30th, Alando was officially sold to eBay for $43 million, just 3 months after it was created. The brothers kept working there for 1 year before leaving and starting their next startup. These brothers saw the example of what eBay had done and copied and followed it to create their own clone of eBay. The three brothers were watching, learning, and following the ways of the entrepreneurs and inventors in Silicon Valley. It was this that led them to create Alando. And we too are following something or someone which impacts our lives. Everyone has intentionally chosen to follow something, whether it's sports, celebrities, TV shows, a book, or whatever it is. We all follow something, and whether we know it or not, these things shape us into who we are. It could be subtle changes like the way we talk, act, or view different scenarios. We all are disciples to these things. It's not a question of if we are a disciple, but actually a question of what are we disciple of? Are we disciples of Jesus? If we say we are, how do we live that out? A good way we can be disciples of Jesus is through spiritual disciplines, which brings us to our next and 28th question in our current series, Catechism in a Year. What are spiritual disciplines? Spiritual disciplines aren't explicitly mentioned within the Bible, but throughout the Bible it talks about the importance of spiritual practices such as self-control, faithfulness, and devotion to God. So if you want to take notes, pull your Riverwood app and follow the Echoes tab to today's question, what are spiritual disciplines? I have 3 points for you today to help answer our question. So I'll start off with number 1, which is spiritual disciplines are habits, routines, and practices that Jesus did. In 1 John 2, verse 3-6, we read, "We know that we have come to know him, and if we keep his command, whoever says, 'I know him,' but does not do what he commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did." The idea of this is to have a relationship with God is shown through obedience to him and his command for you. Verbal claims of knowing God are insufficient. They must be backed by actions that align with God's teaching, mirroring the life and character of Jesus. In John 13, verse 15, we read of a very similar idea. It takes place during the Lord's Supper, where Jesus said to the disciples, "I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." And again in Philippians 2, verse 5, it says, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus." These suggest that we should adopt and imitate the attitude and behavior of Jesus. Jesus was a perfect example for the disciples, as well as for all who follow him. He was a perfect example for what God designed us to be like, and he gave us a perfect example of what we should be doing in order to become more like him. In our attitude and actions, we should be using the discipline of copying what Jesus did to imitate that in our daily lives. The second point is spiritual disciplines are training tools. 1 Timothy 4, verse 7-8 says, "Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly, for physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promises for both the present life and the life to come." Paul is writing to Timothy. He says that we must train to have godliness rather than train for things of this world. How we train to be more godly is by training to be more like Jesus. We can do this through practices like spiritual disciplines. These practices can look different from person to person, but they all work in the same way to achieve the goal of gaining value for this life and the life to come through following and becoming a disciple of God. There's no defined list of what these disciplines are, but rather we are told to follow the examples and live the way that Jesus did. In Luke 6, verse 40, it says, "Students are not greater than their teacher, but students who are fully trained will become like the teacher." When we let Jesus be our teacher and we do what he did, we are being trained to become more like the teacher, which is him. We need to learn to be his students and practice being like Jesus. Spending time in prayer, in the word, serving, in worship, and so many other things. Most importantly, though, we need to desire to grow to be like him, and then you'll become a disciple of his. That brings us to our last point, which is spiritual disciplines remind us that following Jesus requires sacrifice. In Matthew 16, verse 24, it says, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'If any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. While salvation is freely given to us, it does not exempt us from the call to sacrifice to follow Jesus. We must surrender our own desires and deny ourselves of our ways. We need to willingly take up our cross, recognizing that we cannot save ourselves. Our reliance on Jesus for salvation is absolute and irreplaceable. We cannot passively wait to be saved. Rather, we must actively pursue and strive to become more like Him. By practicing these disciplines, we learn to put aside our own ways and align ourselves with God's will. By doing this, we can grow our faith and deepen our relationship with God. So what are spiritual disciplines? Well, spiritual disciplines are practices that imitate the way Jesus lived, that train us to become more like Him. They help us be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do as Jesus did. Like the three brothers of Alondo, they put themselves in a position to learn, become familiar with the product they want to recreate, working hard to imitate that in the context that they were in, which ended up changing their whole lives. And while I'm not suggesting that we go out copying other people's ideas to make millions of dollars, when we copy the life of Jesus, we get everlasting more for our lives than we could ever imagine. And it all starts with putting practices in place in our lives that are copying what Jesus did.
Hey church, well, good morning. A huge welcome to those of you watching online and a huge welcome to those of you here in person. Welcome. My name is Annika Steingard and I'm in grade 11 at Calvin Christian School and I attend Uprising and call Riverwood home. Unless you're like me, you know that the Olympics are happening this summer in Paris. Who wouldn't all love to go to Paris? One of the most anticipated athletes at the Olympics this year is Steph Curry. For those of you who don't know who Steph Curry is an NBA player for the Golden State Warriors who is now training to be in the Paris Summer Olympics of 2024. His training routine consists of practicing around 4 hours every day. I don't know about you, but personally, I would rather get an extra 4 hours of sleep. But during his training, he practices doing shooting drills, ball handling skills, strength training, weightlifting, and vigorous cardio exercises. Also making 500 shots every day. I don't know how he does that, but also on top of all those exercises, he has to work hard to improve his diet from his sweet tooth, because, everybody has a sweet tooth. He gets 10 and a half hours of sleep every night. I'm jealous. And even takes ice baths. Anyways, Steph Curry quotes, "I'm not in love with this grinding, hard, and ridiculous process. I'm in love with getting better." We all have a purpose or goal in life. For all Christ followers, your goal is to be more like Jesus. So why am I talking about Steph Curry? Yes, he is an amazing basketball player, but I'm talking about Steph Curry because he didn't just get into the Olympics or the NBA by default. He got there by working hard and by being dedicated to training and getting better. In the same way, we don't just become like Jesus by default. We have to train and work incredibly hard to be more like Jesus. This is what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 24 to 27 when he is talking to the Corinthians. So here we go. "Do you not know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." Well, in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 24 to 27, Paul is talking about the ancient Olympics in Corinth, not a race that we would necessarily think of. Instead, Paul is using this analogy to the Corinthians for running the Christian race, running to be more like Jesus. This is what it says in 1 Timothy 4, verse 7 to 8, as Lachlan mentioned earlier. "Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come." So, how I would sum up what Paul is saying would be, do not run for the world. Run for God and God only. Do not run for the world, run for God. It's so important to run for God and not for the world. You don't understand how much it changes your relationship with God when you're running for the world and not Him. To answer our question on why do we practice spiritual disciplines, this is why. It is a constant reminder to us and trains us to stop running for the world and to start running for Him. Living in our constantly changing world, we often have trouble differentiating what running for the world versus what running for God looks like. So let me teach you a few of the differences. Running for the world can look like people getting into fads and looking for acceptance from friends. Example, my friends say I will be more cool if I do this, versus running for God looks like not needing the approval of others. Galatians 1 verse 10 says, "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God, or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Wow. I don't know about you, but I feel like this verse is just so powerful and it just calls out a bunch of us, myself included. But seriously, getting approval from man will get you nowhere in your relationship with God. In fact, it can and will really break and destroy your relationship with God. Running for the world can also look like trying to achieve status and identity. But running for God looks like you start with the status of child of God. Peter says in 1 Peter 2 verse 9, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful life." We are chosen. It doesn't matter what your social status is, what you're going through, what your past is. What matters is that you know you are chosen, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, to tell others of God's wonderful works. Okay, church, I'm almost done calling all of us out here. So here's the last one. Running for the world can look like running with no clear path or finish line, versus running for God looks like we may not always know where God is taking us, but we have full faith that God knows what is best for us and that His plan is always for the better. Here's what Proverbs 3 verse 5 to 6 says. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him and He will make your path straight." You may not always have a full understanding of where God is taking you, but He knows, and that's what matters. Do not run for the world, run for God. Running aimlessly will get you nowhere spiritually. Literally nowhere. You need to run with purpose. You have to train daily. It doesn't just come naturally or quickly or overnight. You have to work for it. It's not about trying really hard. It's about training really hard. So we practice spiritual disciplines to become more like Jesus. What are you training for? Are you training to binge watch a new Netflix series, get more likes on social media, training to beat some sort of new world record, or even training for good things that we might be putting a little bit too much time towards? Every day we are training for something. So what are you training for? Now, as we wrap things up, we're going to bring it back to Steph Curry's quote on, "I'm not in love with this grinding, hard, and ridiculous process. I'm in love with getting better." We're going to change it to our own. We're changing it to, "I don't always love all the hard work, routines, self-discipline, or loving our enemies and taking up our own cross, but I'm in love with Jesus." So that, church, is why I and we all should practice spiritual disciplines. With that all being said, here's Kayla with a powerful story.
Hi, my name is Kayla Wicki. I'm a senior in grade 12, and I've been attending Riverwood for 18 years. It was in early 2022. I was starting to kind of feel different things mentally wise through a bit of grade 10, and those few months went by when I was 16, and I was going to therapy, and then my doctor diagnosed that I was struggling with a bit of depression, and I didn't know how to deal with everything with it that well. And during that time, my mom's dad, my grandpa, he got diagnosed with a Pancoast tumor in his upper right shoulder by his lung. of stage 4 cancer. I grew up with him, like him being like my best friend, my number one supporter. A few months went by, he started declining. I had no hope, kind of, at the time. And 2 weeks later, after Uprising camp, we got a call from my uncle at the hospital, and he was saying that, like, you guys need to come now. He has hours left and he hasn't woken up since last night. So we got up and we just drove right over, and 1 minute after all of us got into the room with him, I was holding his hand, and he passed away on November 19th that year. It was hard seeing someone you loved so much in your life die right in front of you. And I was a bit in shock still after he passed away. But since January this year, that was actually probably one of the worst experiences of my life, other than losing my grandpa, when there was a lot of drama going on at school, and these girls were started certain rumors about me that weren't true. And then a few weeks later, after people are still saying stuff about me, my Baba passed away, and she passed away mid-February, and I was like, great, like, come on, God, like, let's keep it rolling, like, add to the list. Like, I was at the point where I was just like kind of like, why are you doing this to me? Probably in the last 2 years to a year and a half, where I saw kind of God's work, I guess, come in, was a bit of bits and pieces. I didn't really see much of it until recently. I was always told that God's work isn't gonna happen like that in the beat of a snap. You can't expect something to be fixed right away or see anything. It might take just a bit. I remember Brittany always told me that school is just one teeny tiny part of your life. That's one tiny surrounding that you go through each day. You still have your home, you still have your whole church community that loves you and wants you here. And I think I saw God's work in that exact sentence, because I was yeah, I do have a community here. I do have good people in my life that actually treat me good, and I see through the love of Christ through them. I think I had the discipline of still coming when I was in the mood to, or I was grumpy, because I knew deep down I really wanted to go. And I honestly don't know sometimes how I had that discipline to come when I was feeling really down. I think deep down I had that discipline to come was because I knew I really wanted to, and I shouldn't have listened. That was just what my mind was feeling, that I just didn't want to go to be around people. But I still felt that little spark that this is where I belong. It is good that I've still kept a bit of spiritual discipline practices, the coming to church weekly, and just keeping also just listening to a bit of that music, I find is a big part for me. I think one thing I wanted to add was a lot of kids, especially in today's society, struggle with mental health, and probably a lot of people in this church, some kids may struggle with mental health, even adults, but it's not normal to feel the way that you're feeling, the lack of faith or hope you're having. I just want to I guess inspire that you try to keep those practices in your life, so you don't, I guess, grow apart from your faith.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a grade 11 student, and I've been going to Riverwood for about 6 years and Uprising for about 4. We've already looked at what spiritual disciplines are and why we should practice them, and now my question for you is, how do we practice spiritual discipline? When someone says discipline, I always think of disciplined soldiers, disciplined people, and disciplined thinkers. But when I was asked to talk about spiritual discipline, my first thought was, yes, I get to learn and explore something new. Because before now, I haven't really put thought towards discipline, never mind spiritual discipline. Lachlan has already defined what spiritual discipline is, and I want to look further into what it means to be disciplined and how to become more disciplined. So like pretty much every other person my age, I looked it up, except Googling is old-fashioned, so I looked it up on good old ChatGPT. It said that discipline is the practice of training oneself or others to follow a code, behavior, rules, or guidelines. It involves self-control, consistency, and the ability to regulate one's actions to achieve a desired outcome or goal. This makes sense. Discipline is when you follow something closely and don't deviate from its set rules. So let's look at how to practice spiritual discipline. Starting with point number 1. Spiritual discipline is a code for life. In math, 1 + 1 is 2. If you say anything otherwise, you're firstly just wrong, and secondly, not disciplined in the code and rules of math. Pastor and author John Mark Comer said that the rule of life is to have a schedule and set of practices and relational rhythms that help us create space in our busy world for us to be with Jesus. He also said, the word rule comes from Latin, stemming from a trellis, for vine. It's a structure we grow on, and it protects us as we develop and learn. While God has made us unique and given us free will, there are also truths for all of us that no matter who we are, following Jesus means following his ways or the code. So how do we practice it? And what would the code be? The code would be setting goals, creating a structured routine, achieving those goals, prioritizing tasks, staying focused, and holding yourself accountable for your own actions. Discipline involves you sacrificing time and energy to grow your discipline. If you don't have a routine, you'll fall out of the rhythm and lose discipline in the code. If you don't have a routine, you'll fall out of the rhythm and lose discipline in the code. If you don't have a routine, get one. And if you have a routine, don't stop. Sounds hard and maybe a bit annoying, doesn't it? Well, that's because it is. In Hebrews 12, verse 11 to 12, it says, no discipline is enjoyable while it is happening. It's painful, but afterwards there'll be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who stay trained in this way. This is actually encouraging, because it says there will be a harvest or time of reward for those disciplined, and for those who sacrifice their time for God, God will reward. Think of it this way. Spiritual discipline can also be seen as a field of study, like math, bio, physics, history. If you ask a historian what happened in 1812, they'll have an answer and will know exactly what they're talking about. If you ask a biologist facts about fats, protein chains, and muscle fibers, they'll have lots to say and will know exactly what they're talking about. If you ask a physicist or chemist about quantum mechanics, they'll talk for hours and try their best to help you understand. If you ask a Christian about Christianity, what will they say? Will you be talking for hours like a chemist and physicist? Will you be as hyped as a historian? Will you know as much as a biologist? They are disciplined in their fields. Are we, as Christians, disciplined in our field? Well, you don't become a physics professor overnight, and it's the same with spiritual discipline. It takes a lot of energy, time putting in the work, and it's not easy. The way to become spiritually disciplined is by spending time with God and time reading his word. We can't just read the words in the Bible, but we have to treat it like a meal. You don't just swallow a sandwich in 2 seconds, get up and go on with your day. You chew it, digest it, get energy. Same with reading the Bible. You read it, then you think about it, take your time reading. Otherwise, you aren't getting any spiritual energy. Don't read chapters, understand the sentences. You practice spiritual discipline by setting aside time to be with God, reading his word, and time in community centered around him. Point number 2, spiritual discipline is your choice. Spiritual discipline is a choice. You have to choose and work on becoming a physics professor. It doesn't just happen. It's hard and takes lots of energy to become spiritually disciplined, but the reward of spiritual discipline will be an orderly life and a closeness with God that you won't get from anywhere else. This week, you have a choice to become disciplined in prayer, worship, and Bible reading, or to become disciplined in scrolling reels on Instagram, watching the news, or watching cat videos on YouTube. The choice is yours. But my prayer is that you choose God to be at the center of your next week and the rest of your life. In Acts, there is a story of Paul and Silas getting thrown in prison. At this time, Christians were being persecuted in the Roman Empire, and while Paul and Silas were going to a place of prayer outside of the town, a little bit like a Bible study, they got caught up and thrown in prison by Romans. In Acts chapter 16, verse 23 to 24, it says, "They were severely beaten, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was ordered to make sure they did not escape. So the jailer put them into the inner dungeon and clamped their feet in the stocks. There was no hope for them." First off, this reminds me of what Jesus said in Matthew, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I will also be." So when Paul and Silas were gathered in prison, what did they do? In verse 25, it says they were praying and worshiping with songs in the prison cell. This is what they would have been doing if they weren't in prison. They were going to a place to pray and worship, but ended up praying and worshiping in an inner dungeon in a Roman prison. Nothing would stop them from worshiping because they had a routine. They had every reason to say, "You know what? I think I'll just have to miss this week's prayer night." That would have been completely fair, but instead they said, "God is more important than this, and I choose to worship him because he deserves it no matter what happens to me." They practiced immense spiritual discipline by choosing to follow through with their routine no matter what. Point number 3, regularly practice discipline in community. Bible study groups are so good for practicing spiritual discipline because you are in community and are able to help others understand and learn, and they can do the same for you. As well as routine is easier when practiced in a group because you can hold others accountable and they can also do the same for you. And here at Riverwood, we have life groups, which are practically Bible study groups. And if you don't have a life group but want one, we have a website for it, or you can contact the welcome booth and they can point you in the right direction. Life groups and Bible studies aren't the only way to practice spiritual discipline. It's just a way to make it easier and a bit more fun. So I highly recommend finding a group or creating one on your own. Okay, let's recap. First off, spiritual discipline is hard, not easy, but there is a promise of peace, right living, and closeness with God that you won't get from anywhere else. Secondly, it's a code and rhythm for life. Get into the routine and practice setting aside time for Him. Thirdly, it's your choice to follow the rules, read your Bible, pray, and worship. Actually understand the sentences, not just read the words. Sacrifice time to do this regularly. Thirdly, groups, community, and consistency. Keep yourself and your group accountable and meet regularly to grow your knowledge, train, and study to be like a physics professor. How do we practice spiritual discipline? We regularly set aside time in our routine of life to study and pray and to become disciplined spiritually. So how about it? Get ready and let's start training.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm in grade 8 and I've been around Riverwood for around 3 years. In the past few messages, they have defined spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are practices that imitate the way that Jesus lived that can show us how to be more like Him. These require sacrifice sometimes, but they remind us to focus on God and not the world. It starts by making a choice and creating routines in our lives that mimics the way of Jesus, not doing it on our own, but gathering people around us to do it with. We are told about these practices and disciplines of Jesus: prayer, fasting, giving, Bible reading, etc. A lot of the time, putting these into practice can be really hard. For me, I think there's kind of 2 types of ways to go about spiritual disciplines. There's ones we do out of habit because we know they're good to do, whereas there are ones that you do because you're passionate about them. A habit I've been really trying to do lately is read my Bible and pray about what I've read. In James 1 verse 22, it says, "Do not deceive yourselves by just listening to His word. Instead, put it into practice." As a follower of Jesus, I need to set these goals and habits for myself. And as my faith changes and grows, so do my goals and habits. Keeping in touch with what God has to say to me is so important in my life. Those are habits that I've set for myself. But a passion and a way that I can connect with God so much deeper is through worship. I love to sing, and when I'm worshiping, I'm not focusing on anyone or anything else. Simply, I feel a sense of belonging, that this is my purpose. This is what I was called to do. Anyone who is called a child of God is called to practice these different types of disciplines as we follow on our unique journeys with Jesus. In doing this, know that there are practices of Jesus that are meant for every stage of life. When life looks a little different in our ages, and even the places in our faith journeys look different, We are invited to follow the way of Jesus through prayer, diving into the Word, fasting, worship, and so many other things. There's so many times in the Bible where Jesus goes and prays. Matthew 14, verse 23. After the crowds dispersed, Jesus went up into the hills to pray, and as night fell, he was there, praying alone with God. Luke 5, verse 16. But Jesus often slipped away from them and went into the wilderness to pray. Those are just a couple examples of such a small thing that we can do, and it was so essential in Jesus' life, and it should be in ours too. As I've grown in my journey, I've noticed that when life is good, I struggle more to keep a really good, strong relationship with Jesus. But I've developed Bible reading, prayer, and worship as disciplines I do to keep that strong relationship with the Lord. I also struggle with who I'm practicing these for. I've had to work on knowing if I'm really doing these things for God or because I want people to think I'm a good Christian. I've learned that it's not so much about what you're doing and how you're doing these disciplines, and it's more about who you are practicing them for. Matthew 6, verse 5 says, "Whenever you pray, be sincere and not like the pretenders who love the attention they receive while praying before others in the meetings and on the street corners." And just after, it continues in Matthew 6:6 saying, "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what you have done in secret will reward you." We should be doing these things out of worship and devotion to God, not because we have to, but because we love God with our whole mind, body, and soul. So as you walk out of the church today, you have a choice. Whether you're in middle school like me or have a few more decades of experience checked off, you have a choice today and every day if you're going to say yes to following Jesus, yes to practicing his ways, and yes to putting in the effort and developing routines to train how we act and think about Jesus. Jesus has already invited you to follow him, and now each new day we can say a fresh yes to following and living in the way of our Lord.